She didn't know she was sitting on a person until the person shifted. For the first 10 minutes on that sled, Thora had convinced herself she was propped against a gear bag. A very large, very warm gear bag that smelled aggressively of spruce resin and wood smoke, and the particular cold that settles into rock faces and doesn't leave until June. She had pressed her face into it without thinking. That's what you do when your core temperature has dropped far enough that your fingers don't bend and your thoughts arrive several seconds behind schedule. You press yourself into warmth and you stop asking whether warmth has opinions. Then the gear bag exhaled, and the arm locked around her waist pulled her closer by exactly 1 inch. "Stop moving," a voice said from somewhere above her head. Low, flat, the voice of a man who had stopped explaining himself to people a long time ago. She moved anyway, turned her head just enough to confirm what her nervous system was insisting on. The man behind her on the snowmobile didn't look down. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, one hand on the throttle, the other arm clamped around her ribcage like a timber brace. He was very large. She was sitting directly across his thighs, sideways, feet dangling off the running board. And she had not noticed until now, because he was roughly the temperature of a wood stove, and her brain had made the comfortable assumption that warmth was a structure, not a person. Right. She was sitting on a stranger's lap in the northern British Columbia wilderness in November. Her camera was still around her neck. She could not feel either of her feet. That was fine. She could address the particulars later. If there was a later. The snowmobile had died at 2:10 in the afternoon, 12 kilometers from anything that appeared on a map. She'd done it wrong. She knew that clearly now, with the retrospective precision that comes from nearly dying. She'd left the machine running on a frozen bog crossing to get a better angle on the caribou herd, pushing through the valley below. The herd had been extraordinary. 43 animals moving south through early snowfall in a long dark line against the white. Exactly the kind of image she had driven 11 hours north and spent the last of her equipment budget to capture. The light was doing something unusual with the low cloud cover. She'd been completely absorbed. She had gotten the shot. She had turned back to find the snowmobile had broken through the bog ice and settled at a 30-degree angle into the frozen mud beneath. Rear track, half submerged. She'd spent an hour trying to free it. Then, when the temperature dropped toward numbers that took on a different quality, not cold like a winter morning, but cold like a statement, she'd started walking south along the creek drainage. She had a map on her phone. She had a phone with 6% battery. She had a down jacket rated to -15. She had 2 granola bars and an unwillingness to think too precisely about her situation, which had served her adequately through 27 years of solo fieldwork and was now finally failing her completely. For 6 hours she had followed the creek. The battery had died at hour 4. The temperature had dropped past -25. When her legs had started doing something strange and disconnected, like they belonged to someone else who happened to be walking directly below her, she had crawled into a hollow beneath the deadfall spruce and stopped moving. Because stopping felt more manageable than falling. She'd been there maybe 20 minutes when she heard it, mechanical and deliberate, growing from the north. She'd crawled out on her hands and knees and waved like a person who had abandoned all remaining options, and the snowmobile had slowed and stopped, and the man on it had looked at her for a long, unreadable moment before saying, without particular inflection, "You're in my way." She'd tried to answer. Her jaw had other plans. He had dismounted, walked toward her with the unhurried gait of someone who had decided not to panic. Regardless of what he encountered, looked at her hands, looked at her face, and sighed, not with pity, with the particular weariness of a man recalculating his afternoon. Then he'd loaded her onto the sled, not gently, not roughly, just efficiently, and that was how she ended up where she was. The cabin appeared the way things appear in heavy snow, suddenly, without preamble, as though it had been placed in the clearing rather than built there. It was not a charming cabin. There was nothing about it that suggested the word cozy. Low dark logs, a pitched metal roof shedding snow in long dirty avalanches, a stovepipe venting straight white smoke into the grey sky, the work of someone who had thought carefully about survival and not at all about anything else. He cut the engine, dismounted, reached back and lifted her off the sled with the same mechanical competence he seemed to apply to everything, like moving cargo that happened to be biological. Her legs gave the moment her feet touched the snow. He caught her by the upper arm, held her upright, and waited. He had a lot of patience, she was already understanding, for things that were inevitable. "Can you walk?" She tried. The answer was clearly no. He sighed. Then he bent, lifted her and carried her inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried meat and old pine. He set her on a narrow cot against the near wall. The mattress was thin, stuffed with something that crinkled, and lit a kerosene lantern, and the room went gold and close. He moved to the wood stove without speaking. She watched him work. He was precise in a small space, in a way that large men usually were not. Nothing bumped, nothing knocked, every motion going directly where it was supposed to go. The fire caught in under a minute. "Boots off," he said, still facing the stove. She held up her hands, purple at the knuckles, fingers that had stopped obeying some time ago. He turned, looked at her hands, and came to the cot. He sat at the foot of it, reached for her left boot, and pulled a folding knife from his pocket. Every alarm in Thora's body went briefly and loudly active. He didn't appear to notice. He sliced through the frozen lace in one clean motion, gripped the heel and toe of the boot, and looked up at her. "It'll hurt," he said. "All right," she said. It did hurt. It hurt like being separated from part of herself. The boot had fused to her sock, the sock to her skin, and when he removed it, she made a sound she hadn't heard from herself before, thin and involuntary, and gripped the edge of the cot and held on. He set the boot aside, peeled the sock. Her foot was the color of old candle wax, the toes edging toward blue at the tips. He walked to the door, scooped a tin bowl of snow from outside, came back. Warm water feels like relief, but it destroys the tissue. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, gray or very dark green. The lantern made it impossible to say. "You have to bring it back slow. It'll feel worse than the freezing did." "Of course it will," Thora said. He pressed a handful of snow against her bare foot. The pain was extraordinary. A white-hot current from her toes, straight up through her hip, her whole leg suddenly insisting on being real again. The shirt smelled like him. She locked her jaw and breathed through her nose and held the edge of the cot, and did not make a sound, because she had decided she was not going to make a sound at a man who was saving her life, and she was stubborn enough to hold to that, even while every nerve ending she possessed strongly disagreed. He worked for 20 minutes, methodical, thorough, relentless, rubbing the stalled circulation back into deadened flesh, with hands that were rough as cedar bark and completely steady. Halfway through, without looking up, he said, "Kia." She blinked. "What?" "My name," still not looking up, just data being offered. She hadn't asked. She'd been focused entirely on not crying. But he had offered it like a transaction, and she felt the reflexive pull of reciprocity. "Thora," she said. He acknowledged this with a single nod. Then he reached for her right boot. The snow did not stop for 3 weeks. Thora learned the cabin the way you learn any small space you're committed to, by mapping it with your body, by understanding the rhythms before the rules. The stove ran hot in the early morning and cooled by evening. The single window faced east, offering pale, useful light from 8 until noon and nothing after. The water tank needed refilling every day before the afternoon. Kia woke before she did, every day without exception, and by the time she was up, The fire was built and coffee was on. He did not ask her to help. He did not ask her to stay out of the way. He simply moved through his days and left space around himself, and she gradually filled portions of that space with the things she noticed needed doing. Swept floors, kept the wood box stocked from the porch stack, learned which of the mismatched mugs he reached for in the morning and which he left alone. He was not a man who made conversation. This did not appear to embarrass him. He sat at the table each evening working with his hands, mending gear, sharpening blades, doing careful things with pieces of wood that she eventually understood were functional rather than decorative. And the absence of talk between them stopped feeling like hostility around day 10 and started feeling like something she didn't have an existing category for. On the 14th day, cleaning the shelf above the stove, she found a photograph wedged into the gap between two logs. It had been there a long time. The edges were soft with handling. She almost didn't look. Then she did. A younger version of Keir, thinner in the face but the same broad frame, wearing a conservation officer's vest. Standing next to a boy of maybe 9, wearing the same kind of vest in a size far too large for him. Both of them holding a GPS unit, both squinting into bright summer sun with the slightly reluctant posture of people who have been asked to hold still for a picture. The boy had his hand on Keir's arm. She put it back exactly as she'd found it. She never said anything about it, but something shifted in how she understood the silence in the cabin. It stopped being a wall she was pressing against and became something more like weather, something that had its own history, its own reasons, something you learn to read correctly rather than push against. 3 days after that, she broke one of the mugs. She'd been making coffee, her hands still slightly clumsy at the knuckles where the frostbite had gone deepest. And she turned too quickly, and the mug went off the shelf and struck the corner of the stove on its way down and shattered cleanly into 4 pieces on the floor. Thora went still. Every calculation, her body had been quietly running for 27 years activated at once. Distance. To the door. Her coat on the hook. His hands, which she tracked to the table where they had been resting flat, on a piece of harness leather he was stitching. He looked at the broken mug. He looked at her. He stood slowly, walked to the shelf and lifted down the dustpan and the small brush hanging on a nail there. He crouched and swept the pieces up without any particular expression. That mug came with the place, he said, almost to himself, tipping the shards into the kindling box. He stood and set the dustpan back, surprised it lasted this long. That was all. Thora turned back to the stove and finished making the coffee. Her hands shook, and it was not from cold. That night she lay on the cot and stared at the dark ceiling joists and took careful inventory. 31 days in this cabin. In that time, Keir had pulled her from a slow death, treated her frostbite correctly, and at cost to himself, given her the only bed, the warmest available socks. First serving at every meal, and his spare wool shirt when she got cold in the evenings, he had not raised his voice. He had not touched her except for necessity. He had not suggested, implicitly, or in any other way, a single thing about what she might owe him for any of it. She had been waiting for the shape of it to reveal itself. The shape of what this would eventually cost her. She was beginning to suspect. She was waiting for something that wasn't coming. She found this more unsettling than any threat she knew how to name. Threats she understood. She had learned to read them young, and the education had been thorough. This, a man who simply did what needed doing and wanted nothing back, she did not have a map for. She fell asleep, still working on it, which was, she realized, only at the edge of sleep, the first time in years she had fallen asleep, working on something other than how to leave. In the 4th week, Keir went up on the roof to reseat the stovepipe cap, which had been rattling in the wind and needed securing before the next storm came through. He told her this in one sentence. She was inside working at unraveling a section of wool sock to re-knit more tightly. Her hands needed something fine to do, or they went stiff at the knuckles. She heard him above her, the measured weight of his footsteps on the metal slope, deliberate and certain. Then a sound she couldn't immediately categorize, a sharp crack, a grinding, a brief, wrong silence. She was through the door before she decided to move. He had gone through a section of weakened decking, his right leg punched through to the knee. He'd caught himself with both hands on the stovepipe brace and was already pulling himself clear, controlled and not panicked, his jaw set. He was not in danger. By the time she processed this, her hand was pressed flat against her own sternum, and her heart was doing something she had no prior framework for, a cold, terrified dropping sensation that had absolutely nothing to do with her own safety. He looked over the roof edge. He looked at her face. "I'm fine," he said. She didn't answer. She was looking at her own hand on her chest, feeling the hard, frightened beat of it, trying to understand what had just happened inside her. "Thora, your feet." She looked down. She'd come out without lacing her boots, and the snow was coming in over the tops, soaking through her socks. "Inside," he said, not unkindly, just a statement of what should happen next. She went. She sat by the stove and she waited, and she did not pretend she wasn't waiting, and when he came through the door, 12 minutes later, she didn't say anything, and neither did he. He filled 2 cups from the pot on the stove and put one in front of her and sat down. Outside, the wind moved through the high spruce, and the stovepipe stood solid, and the mountain went on doing what it had been doing long before either of them arrived, and would continue doing long after. March came in not as a season but as a sound. A drip from the eaves, slow and rhythmic, starting before dawn, the ice beginning its long conversation with spring. Thora lay still and listened to it before she got up. She had learned, over these months, that lying still and listening was often more informative than moving. Keir was at the stove when she rose. His back was to her, and the set of his shoulders was slightly different than usual, careful, almost braced, the way he went still when he was working something out. "Warming up," he said. "I know. Creek'll be passable before the end of the week, maybe sooner." She poured her coffee and stood at the window. The snow on the sill had a thin, wet shine to it. Something was changing in the light. "I'll need a way out," she said. "I know," he said. 4 mornings later, she woke to the sound of an engine. She lay still and listened to it for a full minute because it was impossible. Her snowmobile was frozen in a bog 12 kilometers northeast. It hadn't run since November. She got up. She put on her boots, the oversized pair Keir had found in the supply cache, stuffed with spare socks until they fit, and opened the cabin door. Her snowmobile was parked outside, running. Her camera bag and pack were strapped to the cargo rack. The cracked windscreen had been rewired with copper, done neatly, the kind of repair that takes longer than it looks. Keir was at the woodpile with his back to her, splitting the morning's quota at his usual pace. Not running away from her gaze, not making a performance of ignoring it, just giving her something to look at and space to decide what she made of it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the running machine and the packed bags and understood exactly what she was looking at. "When did you go get it?" she asked. "Last week, when the weather opened up. 12 kilometers into the back country and back, alone to recover a machine that wasn't his, diagnose the fault, repair it, fuel it, pack her belongings onto it, and park it at her door without mentioning it once." She looked at his back. "Did you pack my things? Because you wanted me to leave?" she said, "or because you wanted to make sure I had the choice?" He stopped splitting. He didn't turn right away. The pause stretched long enough that she could hear the creek running hard below the tree line, the ice giving way, the water finding its pace again. "Second one," he said. Thora stepped off the porch. She walked to the snowmobile and reached down and turned the key. The engine cut. The silence that followed was enormous. Just the creek, just the wind in the high spruce, just the mountain in early spring breathing out. She unclipped her camera bag from the rack and held it by the strap. Then she walked back to the cabin, past the door, all the way to where he was standing at the woodpile. He turned. He had the splitting maul in one hand, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night, measuring, steady, waiting to understand what this was going to be. She held up the camera bag. "The light in this valley during the thaw," she said, "is unlike anything I've photographed. I'd need at least another month to do it right." He was quiet for a moment, one of his real silences, not evasion, just thought moving through him at its own pace. Then he turned back to the woodpile. "Breakfast is on the stove," he said. "Don't let it go." She went inside and didn't let it go. When Keir came in 20 minutes later with an armful of split wood, she had 2 cups waiting, and she handed him one without being asked, and he took it without comment. They sat in the small cabin that smelled of smoke and pine and the particular winter they had made it through. And the drip from the eaves ran faster as the morning warmed, and it sounded nothing like an ending. It sounded like permission.